You know, that feeling when something's wrong with your car, but you can't quite identify what it is. The engine sounds a little off. The performance isn't what it used to be, but you keep driving because addressing it would be expensive and inconvenient. And then one day, the check engine light comes on, and you ignore it. You tell yourself, it is probably nothing serious. Maybe it'll go away on its own. Until finally the engine doesn't just malfunction, it fails completely, and then you are stranded, and the repair bill is 10 times what it would have been if you just dealt with the problem when the warning signs first appeared. That is exactly where America is right now with its welfare system. The check engine light has been flashing for years, and most people either didn't notice or didn't want to believe it could be that serious. But every now and then, a story breaks through that makes the problem impossible to ignore, like when someone discovered they had $23,000 sitting on a food stamp card. Not an exaggeration, not a typo. 23,000 actual dollars on a single EBT card in one of the states, now under federal scrutiny for refusing to hand over fraud data. That wasn't an isolated case. That was a symptom of something much larger that has been happening quietly, systematically, for years, while most Americans had absolutely no idea. And here is what makes this so troubling from a systems engineering perspective. When you find an outlier that extreme, $23,000 on a card meant to help someone buy groceries for a month, that tells you the system has no meaningful controls, because that kind of balance doesn't happen by accident. You don't accidentally load someone's food assistance card with enough money to buy a used car. That happens when nobody's checking. When oversight has completely collapsed, when the infrastructure designed to prevent fraud has been disabled or ignored for so long, that exploitation becomes not just possible, but easy. And once people figured out the system wasn't checking, once they realized there were no consequences, the fraud didn't just continue, it metastasized. It grew into something almost unimaginable. We're talking about an $8 billion fraud scheme out of Minnesota alone. $8 billion siphoned from programs meant to feed children, assist people with disabilities, provide housing for those who need it most, dead people receiving benefits, individuals enrolled in half a dozen programs across multiple states simultaneously, housing assistance programs that were supposed to cost a couple million ballooning to over $100 million, because nobody was auditing, nobody was enforcing rules, nobody was watching. And then federal investigators started asking states for basic data, names, eligibility information, immigration status, where relevant, just fundamental information to allow auditors to cross-check and identify fraud. 30 states complied, and the data they provided revealed fraud running into hundreds of thousands of cases. But 21 states refused. They said no. Some cited privacy concerns. Some claimed the federal government lacked authority to demand information. Some just dug in and refused to cooperate. And that refusal, that unwillingness to provide transparency about how federal taxpayer money is being spent, that is when millions of Americans started asking the obvious question. What exactly are they hiding? Because if there is no fraud, if everything is above board, why not just hand over the records and clear the air? The lack of cooperation felt like an admission of guilt, or at minimum, an admission that the records wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. So today I want to walk you through what has actually been happening, how the fraud got so bad, why it was allowed to continue for so long, what the political connections reveal, and why the decisions being made right now will define what kind of country we're living in 30 years from now. Because this isn't just about welfare fraud. This is about whether systems designed to help people can function when oversight disappears, accountability vanishes, and political leaders become more afraid of backlash than they are of breaking the law. Let's start with Minnesota, because that is where the scale of the problem became undeniable. For years, whistleblowers inside Minnesota state government had been trying to sound alarms about massive fraud. Programs meant to feed children, programs for people with disabilities, housing assistance for vulnerable populations. But their warnings were ignored. Worse than ignored, some whistleblowers were threatened, told to back down, to stop making waves, to let things be. And so the fraud continued, and it grew into something that still shocks people when they hear the numbers. Federal investigators estimate the total fraud at somewhere between several billion and $8 billion. One program alone, intended to provide a few million in housing assistance, ballooned to over 100 million. How does a program meant to cost a couple million end up costing 50 times that amount? The answer is simple and disturbing. When no one is watching, when oversight collapses, when political leaders are too afraid of accusations of racism or discrimination to enforce basic rules, the floodgates open. People who understand the system is broken, who know nobody's checking, they exploit it systematically. And in some cases, they coached others on how to do the same. But here is where the story takes a turn that makes this about more than just fraud. As arrests were made and indictments handed down, photos started circulating. Pictures of individuals charged with fraud, people at the center of this multi-billion-dollar scheme, standing alongside high-profile politicians, governors, congresspeople, state officials. And it wasn't just photo ops. Campaign finance records showed these same individuals had donated significant money to political campaigns. Maximum allowable contributions, the kind of money that gets you access, gets your calls returned. Now let me be clear about something important. Taking a photo with someone or accepting a legal campaign donation doesn't automatically make a politician complicit in fraud. Campaigns receive donations from all kinds of sources. Politicians take thousands of photos. But here is what does matter: the pattern. When the same people later indicted for massive fraud were also maxing out donations to multiple officials. When whistleblowers say they were silenced or intimidated. When oversight agencies failed to act despite clear warning signs. You have to ask, how much did people know, and when did they know it? This is what shakes people's faith in institutions. It is one thing to discover fraud exists. It is another to realize the very people elected to stop it may have benefited from it continuing. That the system wasn't just broken by accident, but potentially by design, or at minimum by willful neglect. And this isn't about making it partisan or attacking specific individuals. This is about understanding how fraud grows when accountability disappears. When systems lack transparency, when oversight is weak, when political leaders fear losing votes more than losing integrity, everyone suffers, especially the people the programs were supposed to help. Because every fraudulent dollar paid out, every bogus claim approved, that is money that didn't go to someone who actually needed it. That is money taken from a senior on fixed income, from a child who really was hungry, from a disabled person who genuinely required assistance. The fraud didn't just hurt taxpayers in the abstract. It betrayed real people who depended on those systems working correctly. And for Americans who spent their lives paying into these programs, who believed their contributions would help people in need, this feels like a deep personal betrayal of the social contract. So here's what happened when federal authorities decided enough was enough. The Department of Agriculture, which oversees nutrition assistance programs, made a straightforward request. They asked every state to turn over records. Names, eligibility data, immigration status were relevant. Basic information to allow federal auditors to cross-check and identify fraud. This wasn't an unreasonable ask. These programs are funded by federal taxpayers. The federal government writes the rules about who qualifies. States administer the programs. So naturally, the federal government has not just the right, but the responsibility to verify rules are being followed. 30 states complied. They handed over data, and as we've discussed, that data revealed massive problems. Dead people on the rolls, duplicate enrollments across multiple states, individuals receiving benefits in 6 different programs simultaneously, fraud running into hundreds of thousands of cases. But 21 states refused outright. They said, no, we won't provide the data. Some claimed privacy concerns. Some argued the federal government lacked legal authority. Some simply dug in their heels and refused to cooperate. Now, from a systems perspective, this refusal is fascinating and revealing. If you are administering programs funded by federal taxpayers, why wouldn't you be transparent about how you are spending that money? If you are confident your records are clean, why wouldn't you welcome an audit to prove you are doing it, right? The refusal suggests one of two things. Either the states genuinely believe they have a legal or philosophical right to spend federal money without federal oversight, which is absurd on its face, or they know their records won't hold up to scrutiny. They know what auditors will find. And they're hoping that by refusing to cooperate, they can delay the inevitable or make the political cost of forcing compliance too high for the federal government to bear. This isn't just a bureaucratic disagreement. This is a fundamental question about accountability in a federal system. When the federal government provides funding, does it have the right to verify that funding is being used properly? The answer should be obviously yes. But we've reached a point where some states are openly saying no, you can't check our work, and hoping that sounds like defending state sovereignty rather than hiding fraud. So the federal government drew a line. They said if you won't provide transparency, we'll stop providing funding. No more federal dollars for states refusing to account for how they're spending them. This wasn't punitive in the traditional sense. This was accountability. The federal government saying we have a responsibility to taxpayers. And if you won't help us fulfill that responsibility, we can't keep sending you money. And predictably, this triggered a massive political fight that is still ongoing. States that refused compliance are crying federal overreach. They're claiming this is about states' rights and sovereignty. But here is the reality. This isn't about sovereignty. This is about fraud. If states were running clean programs, they'd have nothing to hide. The fact that they're fighting this hard to avoid audits tells you everything you need to know about what those audits would reveal. And for millions of Americans watching this play out, the conclusion is inescapable. The system has been broken for a long time. People in positions of authority knew it was broken, and they chose to let it continue because fixing it was politically inconvenient, even when fixing it meant billions of dollars returning to programs that actually help people who need help. Now we need to talk about something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. But if we're serious about understanding how these systems broke down, we have to look at the whole picture, not just the easy parts. As investigators examined fraud cases, particularly in states like Minnesota, they noticed patterns involving immigration that couldn't be ignored. A significant portion of people arrested or charged weren't involved in small-scale benefit abuse. Some had been in the country for years, despite having deportation orders. Some had prior convictions, not just in the United States, but in other countries. One individual had been denied asylum specifically because of fraud committed in Canada, yet somehow received protected status in America for a decade. This raises uncomfortable questions that are hard to discuss without accusations of insensitivity or prejudice. But if we're serious about fixing broken systems, we need facts. Here's what the data showed. Among certain immigrant populations, people from regions with ongoing conflict or severe instability, dependency rates on federal assistance were extraordinarily high. We're talking 40 to 50% of people from some countries relying on long-term welfare, not temporary help to get on their feet, not a bridge to self-sufficiency, but ongoing multi-year, sometimes multi-generational dependence on taxpayer-funded programs. And before anyone jumps to conclusions, let me be absolutely clear. This isn't about demonizing immigrants. This isn't saying people fleeing war zones don't deserve compassion. But it is about asking a very practical question. If we know in advance that large percentages of people from certain regions will require long-term government support, if we know vetting processes are weak or non-existent, because those countries lack stable governments, if we know fraud is already a massive problem, then what is the responsible thing to do? For Americans who remember when immigration meant something different, when people came with skills, with determination to build something, with understanding they would support themselves and contribute, this modern reality feels like a betrayal of what immigration was supposed to be. It is not about where someone is from. It is about whether the system is designed to help people succeed, or simply maintain them indefinitely on government assistance. And here is the really troubling part. When fraud investigators interviewed people in these cases, they found some individuals weren't just passive recipients. They were actively exploiting the system. They understood oversight was weak. They knew which programs to target. They knew how to navigate bureaucracy. And in some cases they were coaching others on how to do the same. One program supposed to cost a couple million housing assistance ballooned to over 100 million, because people realized no one was checking, no one was auditing, no one was enforcing rules. So they took advantage and kept taking advantage until federal investigators finally stepped in. For many people, this feels like watching someone rob your house while police stand by and do nothing. Worse, while some officials tell police not to intervene because it might offend the robbers. That is the level of dysfunction we're talking about. And it is why, when the federal government finally decided to take serious action, millions of Americans breathed a sigh of relief. In early 2025, the administration expanded travel restrictions to include countries that couldn't provide adequate vetting information, not because of who the people were, but because their governments were unable or unwilling to help verify identities, backgrounds, and eligibility for entry. Think about it this way. If someone wants to come into your home, you want to know who they are. You want assurance they're not a danger to your family. Now imagine someone knocking on your door, and when you ask for identification, they say, "I don't have any. My country doesn't keep records. You'll just have to trust me." Would you let them in? Would you let dozens in? Hundreds? Thousands? That is essentially the situation the country was facing. So enforcement operations ramped up dramatically. In cities like Minneapolis and New Orleans, places that became focal points for both immigrant populations and welfare fraud, federal agents launched coordinated operations. They weren't rounding people up randomly. They were targeting individuals with criminal records, outstanding warrants, prior deportation orders, or involvement in fraud investigations. In just the first few weeks, dozens of arrests were made. Some were convicted murderers who'd been released back into communities despite immigration holds. Some were gang members with extensive criminal histories. A significant number, close to half in some areas, were tied to ongoing fraud investigations. When you hear those statistics, it is hard not to ask, how are these people still here? How are they allowed to stay, despite deportation orders, despite criminal convictions, despite clear law violations? The answer is that for years, local governments in certain cities refused to cooperate with federal immigration authorities. They declared themselves sanctuary jurisdictions. They refused to honor detainer requests. They released people directly back onto streets, knowing federal agents wanted them in custody. For many Americans, this is incomprehensible. It is one thing to debate immigration policy in the abstract. It is another to release convicted criminals back into neighborhoods, because you don't want to cooperate with federal law enforcement. And predictably, when enforcement operations began in earnest, backlash was immediate. Streets erupted in protests. Media narrative split sharply along political lines. The national divide became even wider. In New Orleans, as federal agents conducted operations, protesters took to the streets. Some businesses posted signs saying immigration enforcement agents were not welcome. One homeowner put up a giant banner reading, "Immigrants make America great." Community activists organized rallies. Local officials criticized operations as heavy-handed and inhumane. On the surface, it looked like grassroots uprising. But if you talk to actual residents, not activists, not politicians, but ordinary people living in those neighborhoods, you often heard a very different story. Many were relieved. They were grateful. They thanked agents. They provided tips about individuals involved in criminal activity or fraud. One federal official described walking through a New Orleans neighborhood and being stopped repeatedly, not by protesters, but by residents who quietly said, "Thank you for being here. We've been asking for this for years." That contrast tells you something important. The loudest voices aren't always representative. The people making the most noise aren't always speaking for the community. Sometimes what looks like a popular movement is actually a small, highly motivated group, amplified by media coverage. Now, were there legitimate concerns? Of course. Any large-scale enforcement operation carries risks. There were stories of people stopped who were in the country legally. Families frightened and confused. Children wondering if parents would come home. Those are real human costs that deserve to be taken seriously. But here is the other side. For every family disrupted by enforcement, there were families victimized by criminals. The system refused to deport. Communities terrorized by gang members who should have been removed years ago. Seniors who had identities stolen for welfare fraud. Disabled individuals whose benefits were reduced because programs ran out of money. Money siphoned off by fraudsters who never should have been in the country. The media rarely covers those stories. They don't make good television, but they're just as real. And for Americans who see the whole picture, who remember when laws were enforced and borders meant something, the protests feel disconnected from reality. They feel like political theater designed to score points rather than solve problems. What we're really dealing with is a system that can no longer be ignored. For decades, problems were papered over. Fraud was tolerated because fixing it was politically inconvenient. Immigration laws were selectively enforced because full enforcement was controversial. Oversight was weak because accountability was uncomfortable. Year after year, problems compounded. Think of it like a dam with cracks. At first, the cracks are small. A little water seeps through, but it is manageable, so you don't fix it. Then cracks get bigger. More water comes through. But fixing it would be expensive and disruptive, so you delay and delay until one day the dam doesn't just leak, it fails. And when it fails, damage is catastrophic. That is where America is right now. The cracks have been visible for years. Whistleblowers pointed them out. Audits identified them. Common sense made them obvious. But fixing them required courage, required leaders willing to make unpopular decisions, required confronting uncomfortable truths. For a long time that courage didn't exist, but something has shifted. Maybe it was the scale of fraud becoming undeniable. Maybe it was ordinary Americans finally saying enough. Whatever the reason, corrections delayed for so long are finally happening. And what happens next will define what kind of country we're living in for the next 30 years. If these efforts succeed, if fraud is dramatically reduced, if immigration is brought under control, if accountability is restored, we'll have proven these systems can be fixed, that it is not too late. But if these efforts fail, if protests shut down enforcement, if states continue refusing transparency, if fraud continues unchecked, we're looking at a very different future, where systems collapse entirely, where trust is completely gone, where the social contract holding a country together simply dissolves.